This is for you, my shining light. May it make your journey a little happier." The Four Horsemen arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign. Not a bad sign in the prophetic sense. Those were technically excellent, and they had all been correctly deployed in the correct order, which was something of a miracle given the administrative situation. But a bad sign in the practical sense, because Tuesday was when the Mortlach County Council held its planning committee, and the planning committee had jurisdiction over all large public gatherings, processions, and what the relevant bylaw described as events involving animals, vehicles, or combinations thereof on public roads. 4 horses, even apocalyptic ones, were animals. The road through Mortlach High Street was a public road. The relevant bylaw was very clear. The horsemen were pulled over outside the post office by a traffic warden named Janet, who had been ticketing vehicles in Mortlach for 19 years, and was not prepared to make an exception for beings of divine wrath just because they had very dramatic cloaks. "Do you have a procession permit?" Janet asked. War, who was 8 feet tall, red-eyed, and carrying a sword that had the general dimensions of a small boat, looked down at Janet from atop a horse the color of arterial blood. "We are the harbingers of the end of days," War said. "That's lovely," said Janet. "Do you have a permit?" It was not a question the second time. It turned out they did not have a permit. This was, War would later acknowledge in the complaint letter that the Celestial Administrative Office sent to the Mortlach County Council, an oversight that had occurred during the extremely compressed timeline of the end-time scheduling process, which the Mortlach County Council's response noted was not our department's concern, as the permit application process is available online and takes approximately 10 working days, with an option to expedite for an additional processing fee. Horsemen retreated to the car park of the Tesco Express at the edge of town to regroup. Pestilence, who had brought a plague of locusts in a sealed container because he believed in doing things properly, set the container on the bonnet of a Ford Focus and opened his scheduling book. The scheduling book was extremely thick. It had bookmarks. Several of the bookmarks had sub-bookmarks. "We need a permit," Pestilence said. "I'm aware," said War. "The online form requires a processing window of 10 working days, I'm aware. Are currently scheduled to initiate the final reckoning at," Pestilence checked the book, "Thursday." "Thursday? This Thursday, yes." War looked at the sealed container of locusts. The locusts looked back with the patient hunger of creatures that had been waiting since the dawn of time and were prepared to wait a bit longer, but only a bit. "Can we expedite? There's an additional processing fee." "Much?" Pestilence consulted a different section of the book. £75. Death, who had been sitting on his pale horse at the edge of the car park staring into the middle distance in the manner of someone who had been doing this for billions of years and had long since made peace with the tedium of it, said, "We don't have pounds." "Have dominion over all living things," Famine pointed out. Famine was thin, sharp-featured, and had the energy of someone who had been denied a snack on a long flight and had elevated the experience to cosmic philosophy. "Dominion over all living things is not accepted as a payment method," Pestilence said, with the tone of someone who had already checked. There was a silence in the car park of the Tesco Express. A seagull landed near Famine's horse, looked at Famine, and flew away very quickly, which was the correct instinct. "Right," said War. "We reschedule." The Celestial Administrative Office, which handled all end times logistics from a building in the upper firmament that looked remarkably like a mid-century office park, received the rescheduling request at 4:47 on Tuesday afternoon. The request was handled by an administrator named Clarence, who had been in the CAO for 11,000 years and had the bearing of a man who had seen everything, filed everything, and was no longer capable of surprise. Clarence reviewed the rescheduling request, checked the end times calendar, which was maintained in a bespoke software system called Eschaton 3, the upgrade from Eschaton 2 having itself been delayed for 6 centuries due to a procurement disagreement, and identified the next available slot. The next available slot was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks was, astronomically and theologically speaking, an eye blink. In terms of the practical experience of four beings who had spent Tuesday afternoon in a Tesco car park arguing about processing fees, it was somewhat more significant. Clarence sent the confirmation email. The confirmation email included a reference number, a 15-point terms and conditions document, and a note reminding all parties that rescheduling more than twice in a calendar year would require a review by the End Times Steering Committee, which met quarterly. It was the second rescheduling this year. Clarence made a note in the relevant file. The file was very thick. It had been very thick for some time. For context, the first rescheduling had occurred in February. The signs had been impeccable. The 7 seals had been opened in correct sequence. The CAO had introduced a seal opening checklist in the 14th century after an incident involving seal 4 being opened before seal 3, the consequences of which had been embarrassing and were not discussed, and the preliminary signs of doom had been dispatched with impressive efficiency. A blood moon, a plague of frogs. Several rivers running in directions that rivers did not traditionally run, which had caused significant consternation among the local water authorities. The Whore of Babylon had arrived in a hire car because her horse had a hoof condition. This was where things had begun to unravel. The hire car, a Nissan Qashqai in an unfortunate shade of beige, had broken down on the M6 northbound, approximately 4 miles from the junction where the Great Beast was scheduled to emerge. The Great Beast, who had his own scheduling to adhere to, had emerged anyway, on the correct junction, on the correct date, at the correct time, and had then waited at the agreed location for 45 minutes before concluding that he had been abandoned and returning underground with the wounded dignity of someone stood up on a first date. The Whore of Babylon had been recovered by the AA, which had its own waiting time issues. Without the symbolic arrival of the Whore of Babylon, the sequence could not proceed. The End Times had a specific narrative logic, and the CAO was adamant about narrative logic after several misfires in the early centuries when people had tried to improvise. Improvised apocalypses, as one internal memo had noted in the 3rd century, were theologically inconsistent and structurally unsound, and the remediation work takes longer than simply doing it correctly. February's End Times had been rescheduled. The blood moon was allowed to complete on the grounds that it had already been deployed, and retrieving a moon was more trouble than it was worth. The frogs were collected and redistributed. The rivers were gently corrected. A cover story involving unusual meteorological phenomena was issued to the press, who accepted it with the ease of a species that had been explaining away signs of doom as meteorological phenomena since approximately the Bronze Age. 3 weeks passed. They passed in the way that 3 weeks pass when 4 cosmic beings of absolute destruction are waiting in a bed and breakfast in Mortlach because their expense forms hadn't been approved in time to book anything else. The bed and breakfast was called the Heathview, was run by a woman named Brenda, and had a strictly enforced checkout time of 10:30. Death had, on the second morning, failed to vacate his room by 10:30. Brenda had knocked. Death had opened the door. They had regarded one another across the threshold. Brenda had charged him an additional night. Famine had found this very funny. War had not found anything funny in approximately 4,000 years, but had come closest in that moment. Pestilence had been busy writing what he described as observational notes in a small notebook he had purchased from the Tesco Express, and which was rapidly filling up with reflections on the human experience that ranged from the genuinely philosophical to a 2-page meditation on why the full English breakfast existed, and what it said about civilization's relationship with its own mortality. The town of Mortlach, for its part, absorbed the presence of the Four Horsemen with the equanimity of a small English market town that had survived 2 world wars, 3 recessions, and the arrival of a little that everyone had complained about for 18 months before quietly becoming regulars. The horsemen were unusual, certainly. The horses were very large and required more parking space than the council's guidelines accommodated. Death made people uncomfortable, though several of Brenda's regular customers noted that he was actually quite pleasant once you got past the initial impression, and he had very good manners at breakfast. War had gotten into an argument with a man named Keith at the pub. This was, everyone agreed afterward, inevitable. Keith argued with everyone at the pub. He was not selective. He had once argued with a visiting professor of astrophysics about the nature of black holes and had, by general consensus, not won but also not entirely lost, which was more than most people managed. War and Keith had argued for 3.5 hours about whether strength was the highest virtue. Keith maintained it was decency. War maintained it was strength. By midnight they had reached a draw that both parties found unsatisfying, which meant it was probably an accurate result. Pestilence added 4 pages to his notebook. The 3 weeks elapsed. The permit was approved. The Mortlach County Council had processed the procession application, conducted a risk assessment, which had required some creative categorization. As the risk assessment form did not have a box for cosmic annihilation, and the nearest applicable option was large-scale civic event with potential for significant disruption, and issued the permit with a list of conditions. The conditions included a noise limit of 65 decibels at the boundary of residential areas, which Pestilence pointed out was going to be extremely difficult given that the trumpets of doom were specifically designed to be heard across the entire Earth. A requirement that any animals involved be accompanied by appropriate veterinary documentation. A prohibition on open flames within 15 meters of listed buildings. And a request that the horsemen provide contact details for their public liability insurer. War had read the conditions 3 times. "They want us to be quiet," he said. 65 decibels, Pestilence confirmed. Trumpets of doom are not 65 decibels, no. They are specifically designed to crack the firmament. The permit notes that cracking the firmament may require a separate structural consent from the relevant authority. War set down the permit. He picked it up again. He set it down again with slightly more force. "Who is the relevant authority for the firmament?" Pestilence checked his book. "It falls under the jurisdiction of the Celestial Planning Commission, which is separate from the CAO and operates on a different calendar system." "How different?" "They measure time in eons." "How many eons does approval take?" "The current backlog," Pestilence said carefully, "is 2 eons. Death, who had spent the morning reading a newspaper with the focused attention of someone who genuinely found the business section interesting, folded the paper and said, "We need to reschedule." Famine put his head on the table. The End Time Steering Committee met, as scheduled, in the upper firmament on the 3rd Thursday of the month. The committee consisted of 7 members, a quorum of 5, and a chairperson named Bartholomew who had held the position for 8,000 years primarily because no one else wanted it. Bartholomew had the energy of a man who had agreed to chair one meeting and then found, through a series of small bureaucratic increments, that he had chaired several million. He was not bitter about this. He was, however, very thorough. The agenda for this meeting included, under Item 6, second rescheduling of the final reckoning, review and recommendations. Item 6 was reached at approximately the point where Bartholomew's patience, which was considerable and had been forged by experience into something close to geological, was beginning to show strain. "Situation," Bartholomew said, "is that we have now twice failed to initiate the final reckoning due to administrative obstacles. The committee is requested to advise on next steps." There was the sound of papers being shuffled. Several committee members reviewed documents. One member, a being named Elspeth, who had joined the committee in the 17th century and was the only member who consistently read the pre-circulated papers, raised a hand. "I have reviewed the rescheduling history," Elspeth said. "This is, in fact, the 14th rescheduling in the past 6 centuries, not the second." Bartholomew looked up. "Previous 12 were attributed to various causes," Elspeth continued, producing a summary document that she had clearly prepared in advance and which was, by committee standards, alarmingly well organized. The 1348 attempt was postponed due to the Black Death already underway, which the CAO deemed thematically conflicting. The 1666 attempt, the Great Fire of London, was reclassified as a partial event, and the main sequence was held pending assessment of whether partial events counted toward completion, which was not resolved until 1702, at which point the scheduling window had closed. The 1912 attempt, the Titanic, said a committee member who had not spoken yet. Titanic was not an attempt, Elspeth said firmly. The Titanic was a boat. It is not in the records. She returned to her document. The 1945 attempt was postponed due to what the records describe as insufficient consensus on whether humanity had already effectively ended itself, rendering celestial intervention redundant. The 1962 attempt, the Cuban Missile Crisis, said the same committee member. Again, said Elspeth, not in our records. Again, a human event. Again, not relevant. She set down her document. The pattern across 14 reschedulings is consistent. Preparation is adequate, deployment is attempted, and then something mundane intervenes. A permit, a breakdown, a planning committee, a parking issue. Bartholomew looked at his notes. A parking issue. The 1987 attempt was abandoned because the Four Horsemen could not find suitable parking near the designated emergence point, and the sequence requires them to be within proximity for the opening movement. The 1987 rescheduling is listed in our records as logistical complexity, Bartholomew said. Yes, said Elspeth. It was a parking issue. There was a long silence in the upper firmament. What, said Bartholomew with great care, is the committee's recommendation? The committee recommended a working group. The working group was to report back in 1 quarter. Bartholomew noted the action, closed the meeting, and sat alone in the room for some time afterward, staring at the agenda in the way of a man who has chaired 8,000 years of meetings and is beginning to understand that the meetings are the point. Meanwhile, on Earth, the signs continued. The signs were on a separate operational timeline from the main sequence. They were, technically, prepositioning activities, which meant they proceeded independently of the main rescheduling and were not subject to the same approval processes. This was an administrative quirk that had never been corrected because correcting it would require an amendment to the foundational end times operational framework, which had last been comprehensively reviewed in the 4th century, and which no one at the CAO wanted to open because the document was 700 pages long and 3 of the key definitions were circular. The signs, therefore, kept happening. There had been, in the past 6 months alone, 2 blood moons, one genuine, one later determined to be an atmospheric refraction event, but the CAO had deployed the second one, and it counted. A proliferation of strange weather that the meteorological services attributed to climate change, which was accurate. An increase in unexplained animal behavior that the zoological community attributed to habitat disruption, which was also accurate and not mutually exclusive with being a sign, and the specific variety of general unease that settled over populations at intervals, and that scholars variously attributed to economic conditions, social fragmentation, or the cumulative effect of too much news. A theologian named Professor Myra Osei at the University of Mortlach, who was, in one of those geographic coincidences that are perhaps not coincidences, based in the same town where the Horsemen had spent 3 weeks in a bed and breakfast, had published a paper in the previous autumn noting the clustering of signs with meticulous academic precision. The paper had attracted mild interest in theological circles, a brief flurry of attention online, and a politely dismissive review in a major journal that described her methodology as rigorous but her conclusions as insufficiently cautious. Professor Osei had filed the review in a folder labeled "People Who Will Be Embarrassed Eventually," and continued her work. She had also, as a point of personal curiosity, submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Mortlach County Council asking about unusual procession permit applications in the past year. The council had replied, as required by law, within 20 working days. The reply had included 1 permit application for a group listing their organization as the Celestial Administrative Office End Times Division, their event type as Procession Apocalyptic, and their expected attendance as all of humanity. Professor Ose had read this 3 times. Then she had made a cup of tea. Then she had called the number listed on the application. Clarence answered on the 3rd ring. He answered with the tone of someone who took all calls with equal seriousness regardless of origin, because after 11,000 years you either developed equanimity or you didn't survive, and Clarence had very much survived. Celestial Administrative Office, he said. End Times Division. Clarence speaking. How can I help? Hello, said Professor Osai. My name is Professor Myra Osai. I'm a theologian at the University of Mortlach. I've obtained a copy of a permit application you filed with our local council, said Clarence. The Apocalypse. Final Reckoning, yes, which has been rescheduled. Twice in the current cycle, yes. Professor Oz sat with this for a moment. How many times total? There was a pause on Clarence's end that Professor Oz, who had interviewed many people who were deciding how much to tell her, recognized as a calculation pause. 14, Clarence said. 14 reschedulings. Past 6 centuries, yes. What is the current status? Under review by the End Times Steering Committee. The working group's report is expected at the next quarterly meeting. When is the next quarterly meeting? 3 months from now. The apocalypse, Professor Osai said, has been referred to a working group. That's correct. Before the working group reports, nothing can proceed. The main sequence requires committee sign-off, yes. The signs can continue. Preliminary positioning is ongoing. But the main sequence is paused pending the report. Professor Osai made a note. What was the cause of the most recent rescheduling? Permit conditions, Clarence said. Specifically the noise restriction and the requirement for structural consent for the firmament cracking. The Celestial Planning Commission's current backlog. 2 eons, Professor Osai said. There was a longer pause. How did you know that? I'm a theologian who's been studying end times logistics for 12 years, Professor Osai said. I've read everything. I just didn't know any of it was literal until about 20 minutes ago. She looked at her notes. The permit application lists a contact address in the upper firmament. Is that? We don't give out the full address, Clarence said. Data protection. Right. Professor Oz set down her pen. Clarence, can I ask you something? You can ask. Does anyone ever stop and consider whether the rescheduling is itself meaningful? 14 delays in 6 centuries. The mundane keeps intervening, a parking space, a permit, a horse with a hoof condition. A very long pause. That's above my pay grade, Clarence said finally. Whose pay grade is it? The committee's, theoretically, though as of Thursday it's a working group's. A working group, Professor Osei said. Yes. The fate of all humanity is currently in the hands of a working group. Reporting to the committee, yes. Who report to, well. That's above my pay grade as well. The working group consisted of 3 members, a secretary, and a terms of reference that had been drafted by Elspeth and was therefore unusually precise. They met 4 times. At the first meeting, they established the scope. At the second, they reviewed the evidence. At the third, they argued about the methodology for their recommendations, which was where Elspeth had anticipated the trouble would occur and had prepared accordingly. At the fourth, they agreed on their findings. The findings were delivered to the committee on a Thursday. The key finding was this. The pattern of delay was not accidental. The mundane interventions, the permits, the parking, the breakdowns, the noise restrictions, the planning committees, were consistent enough across 14 attempts over 6 centuries that their cumulative effect was statistically indistinguishable from intent. Something, the working group noted carefully, kept happening. That something was the ordinary functioning of the world, its bureaucracies, its processes, its remarkable capacity to generate forms that needed to be filled in. The working group did not make a recommendation about what this meant. The working group was a working group, not a theological court. It documented, it found, it submitted. Bartholomew read the report twice. He looked at the 14 reschedulings listed in Elspeth's appendix. He looked at the permit conditions from Mortlach County Council, which were attached as Exhibit F. He looked at the claim form for the AA callout relating to the Nissan Qashqai, which was Exhibit K. He sat for a while in the room after the committee members had filed out. Then he wrote a memo. The memo went to the Four Horsemen, care of the Heathview Bed and Breakfast, Mortlach, which was still, apparently, their registered address because no one had updated it. War read the memo at the breakfast table. Famine read it over his shoulder. Pestilence read it separately and made notes. Death read it, and then looked out the window for a while at the Mortlach High Street, where Janet the traffic warden was issuing a ticket to a van that had been parked on double yellows, and the van's owner was explaining at some length why this was unreasonable, and Janet was explaining at shorter length why it was not. The memo said, in the formal language of the Celestial Administrative Office, that in light of the working group's findings, the End Time Steering Committee had resolved to pause the main sequence indefinitely pending a comprehensive review of the operational framework. The preliminary signs would continue on their existing schedule, as discontinuing them would require a separate amendment process. The Four Horsemen were thanked for their patience and would be contacted when the review was complete. The review was expected to take some time. Some time, War said. Yes, said Pestilence. Much time is some time. The operational framework review is estimated at, Pestilence checked, 4 to 6 centuries. Famine made a sound. There's a complaints procedure, Pestilence added, reading further. If any party wishes to contest the pause, they can submit a formal objection within 30 working days. The objection will be reviewed by the committee at the next quarterly meeting. Which is in 3 months, War said. Yes. War looked at his sword, which was propped against the wall next to the umbrella stand, which it dwarfed considerably. He looked at his horse, which was visible through the window in the pub car park across the road, where Brenda had negotiated an arrangement because the bed and breakfast's own parking was not designed for animals of that size. He looked at Keith, who was just arriving at the pub for what Keith called a quick one before lunch and what everyone who knew Keith understood to be the beginning of a sustained engagement. Keith saw War through the window and raised a hand. War raised a hand back. We could object, Famine said. We could, War agreed. The objection would go to committee. 3 months. If approved, would go back to the scheduling process, which would require a new permit which takes 10 working days, or £75 to expedite, which we don't have, and structural consent for the firmament, which is a 2-aeon backlog. Right, said Famine. There was a silence at the breakfast table of the Heathview bed and breakfast, Mortlach. Death had not said anything during this exchange. Death had been looking out the window. Death had been watching Janet issue the ticket and the van owner contest it and the ordinary machinery of ordinary life proceed with the stubborn persistence of things that did not know they were supposed to stop. We could, Death said, go for a walk. Everyone looked at him. It's a reasonable morning, he said, and we have time. Professor Ose saw them on the high street at 10:30. She recognized them immediately. It was not difficult, given the horses, the dimensions, the general atmosphere, and considered for approximately 3 seconds. The full range of responses available to a theologian who has spent 12 years studying the end times and has just encountered its principal agents buying coffee from the van outside the town hall. She bought a coffee herself and walked over. Professor Osei, said Pestilence, who had read her paper and found it methodologically sound. You know who I am, she said. You called Clarence, War said. He mentioned you. It's still, she paused, adjusting the question. Has it been rescheduled again? Paused, said Death. Indefinitely, pending a review. Professor Osei looked at the 4 of them standing on the Mortlach High Street with their coffees and their enormous horses and the general demeanor of beings who had spent 3 weeks in a bed and breakfast and had, somewhere in that time, become something like familiar. What are you going to do? We don't know, War said. It sounded from him like an honest answer rather than an evasion, which was interesting. We could object, Famine said. Formally. You could, Professor Osei said, or they looked at her. Been studying the delays for 12 years, she said. The pattern is very consistent. Every time the sequence is disrupted, it's by something ordinary. Not resistance, not divine counterwill, not the heroic defiance of humanity, just the world being the world. Forms, processes, things that don't move quickly. She held her coffee cup in both hands. Has it occurred to anyone in the upper firmament that the delays might be the point? No one said anything for a moment. The working group noted something similar, Pestilence said, carefully. And what did the committee do with that? Commissioned a review. 4 to 6 century review, War said. Yes, Professor Osei nodded slowly. So in 4 to 6 centuries, someone will determine whether the delays are the point. And in the meantime, the signs continue, Death said. The preliminary positioning is ongoing and the review proceeds. You are in Mortlach, War said. Apparently. Janet appeared at the edge of the square and looked at the horses with the expression of a woman doing a calculation. She produced her notebook. She walked toward them. She stopped in front of War's horse. Is this yours? She said. Yes, said War. It's on a double yellow. War looked at the horse. The horse was, in fact, on a double yellow. The horse had been on a double yellow since they arrived, because there was no other parking that could accommodate a horse of its dimensions, and because the planning committee had not yet addressed the question of apocalyptic equine parking in the updated traffic management plan, which was currently in consultation. We'll move it, War said. Thank you, said Janet, and made a note and moved on. Professor Ose, I watched this happen. She looked at the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, who were moving their horses off a double yellow line on the high street of a small English market town, while the review proceeded and the signs continued, and the working group's report sat in an archive in the upper firmament waiting to mean something. She took out her notebook. Right, she said. From the beginning, tell me everything. I have a paper to write. Pestilence, who respected rigorous methodology, offered her a copy of his notes. They were extremely comprehensive. The section on the full English breakfast alone was 14 pages. Above the town, at the edge of what could charitably be called the visible atmosphere, and what could more accurately be described as somewhere in the administrative jurisdiction between Earth and the upper firmament, a blood moon that had been deployed 6 weeks ago, and never retrieved drifted with the patient non-urgency of something that had nowhere to be. It was technically a sign of what exactly remained, as it had always remained pending review. Thanks for listening until the end. Please like and subscribe.